Good afternoon, everyone, and good morning to our West Coast friends. Thank you so much for joining our webinar today. We are excited to share some of our recent work with you and ideas and strategies we have for seeing how states are using new Child Care Development Block Grant funds. So before I pass the webinar over to my esteemed panelists, I want to give you just a little bit of background on CCDBG. It was initially enacted in 1990. The Child Care Development Fund is the largest federal funding stream for child care subsidies. This helps low-income families afford high-quality child care so that they can work or participate in education or training. So the Child Care Development Fund, CCDF, which you'll likely hear, the funding is delivered to states through a block grant. And that block grant is known as the Child Care and Development Block Grant. That's the CCDBG that you'll see scattered throughout these slides. In 2018, Congress appropriated a $2.3 billion increase to funds in the CCDBG. So these funds were really given out to support implementation of 2014 reauthorization standards around eligibility, child care quality, health and safety, access to child care, and workforce supports. They were also to serve additional families, provide professional development for child care workers, and increase provider payment rates. So state leaders, with the support of state and national partners, have been developing and implementing plans to spend that additional money and support young children and their families in accessing high-quality child care. So on this webinar, we have 4 experts coming to you from national organizations who are going to share national trends that they've been seeing, and state stories about innovative strategies that states are implementing to use these increased CCDBG funds. So thank you so much for joining today. I should have introduced myself right off the bat. I'm sorry about that. My name is Beth Jordan. I direct policy communications at Child Trends. And our presenters today are Christine Johnson-Stobe. She's a senior policy analyst in the Child Care and Education at CLASP. Jacob Stewart, Manager of Policy and Governmental Affairs at Child Care Aware of America. We have Karen Schulman, Child Care and Early Learning Center Research Director at the National Women's Law Center, and Carlise King, who's the Executive Director of the Early Childhood Data Collaborative, which is housed here at Child Trends. And today our webinar format is a little bit different. Rather than having all of these experts share longer presentations, we've asked them to respond to 3 specific questions about their CCDBG work. We asked them, what are they trying to understand with their current studies? What are those research questions that they're grappling with? We asked them to share a little bit about what they are currently learning. What innovation have they seen? What interesting findings? And last, we asked them what resources they have to share, because we know so many of you who are joining us today are joining us because you are doing this work. You're working in states, you're working on the ground, and we want to make sure that you have access to all of this good research and information. So I'm going to invite the presenters to each take a turn responding to each of these questions. And those are my questions, but we really encourage you all to ask questions of them as well. So if you look at your little panel on the right side of your webinar screen, you'll see a spot where you can type in questions. At any point during the webinar, you can start right now. Send in questions to me, and I'll be asking our presenters them after they get done with their first 3 questions. Just as a note to folks as well, so you know, we are going to be recording today's webinar, and we will send a link to the webinar out with other materials after the webinar has been wrapped up. All right, so our very first question, what did you want to understand about the Child Care Development Block Grant? And I'm going to pass the webinar over now to Christine to kick us off.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thanks for including me in this webinar. It's so great to see so many people online seeking to learn more about this historic investment and what impact it had. At CLASP, we are an anti-poverty organization with a focus on racial equity. And so in all of our work, part of the question we want to answer is, how is this policy or investment impacting different populations? How is it impacting those who are most underserved or underrepresented? And how is it addressing inequity issues, and specifically racial inequity issues? and income inequity. So we had, prior to the dollars being invested, collected data around the potential impact of funding and also access to the Child Care and Development Block Grant and the subsidy systems that it funds by race and ethnicity. And so we knew there were inequities in the system, and we knew that there was a number of children who could be better served with some massive investments on the federal level. We also had been watching the trends of underfunding the Child Care and Development Block Grant and the state child care subsidy programs over decades. So I think all of the lessons that we talk about today are going to be, lessons in how states respond to a program that had been so historically underfunded and then suddenly had this great opportunity riding on the heels of the reauthorization that came just a couple of years before and really changed some of the structure of the program in terms of what state decisions were made and what federal decisions were made. So all of that said, I think most of the lessons that we learned came from our work directly with state administrators and advocates around the reauthorization, starting with the reauthorization and implementing changes of the reauthorization, and then when the new money came, how did that change the picture? What made the difference? And what we saw was that we knew the impact that the dollars could have in supporting access to high quality care, both in terms of more children being able to participate and in terms of higher payment rates. And in states where they were poised and had already identified those issues of either underutilization or under lack of access, extremely low eligibility, or extremely low payment rates, some states were really ready to move on that already. And that was really good to see. And we saw a number of states really quickly take action. But what we also wanted to learn was what are some of the opportunities for using the dollars that we weren't yet quite seeing, and how are states going to prioritize them around multiple needs when, again, they've been underfunded for so long. And we wanted to understand the types of supports that we could provide, that other organizations could provide, and that the federal government or other institutions could provide that would be most useful to state policymakers to get the dollars out the door quickly. And then, of course, for us, one of the key questions was, how can you use these dollars really to address racial inequity in terms of access to the subsidy systems in states? And I'm going to turn it over to Jake to go next.
All right, thank you so much, Christine. Hi, everybody. My name is Jacob Stewart from Child Care of America. And just so you know, I'm going to be speaking through the lens of a few resources that we have regarding CCDBG. The first two questions will be about the resource that you see in front of you right now, which is a website called stateofchildcare.org. And this is a website that is bringing together 5 different organizations, the ones that you see on the your left-hand side of the screen. So NACI, Child Care of America, Bipartisan Policy Center, First 5 Years Fund, and the Center for American Progress. And we came together and created this website for a few reasons. First is as a way to present about what states are doing when it comes to CCDBG, so really the main topic of this webinar. And of course, as a way to present what the key news and events are for both at the federal and the state level. A lot of us have different members across the states, and so we wanted to present one consolidated location that not only talked about what CCDBG is, but also enabled those within states to be able to get access in one place, in one location, to the different information within states, as well as the different news and events at both the federal and the state level when it comes to CCDBG. The primary reason for this is that we wanted to limit how each organization was kind of operating independently and instead kind of bring our resources together in order to create this website and ensure that there's kind of a one-stop shop when it comes to getting information for CCDBG that people can access. And so in the creation of this website is how we ended up getting a lot of the results that we'll present to you in this webinar today. And I think really one of the best things that have come about in creating this resource is that it got multiple organizations talking to one another about what's happening in CCDBG and being able to relay that information to federal policymakers. As we know, the Child Care and Development Block Grant, it is a block grant. So understanding what different states are doing and understanding the key news that's happening out of states is really important to be able to communicate about CCDBG to federal policymakers or federal stakeholders. And so by bringing all of us together, we're able to make that process more efficient and really break down some barriers to the communication process. And now I'm going to transition to Karen from the National Women's Law Center.
Thanks. We've been looking at how states are using the funds through two different approaches. One, where we just collected some qualitative and descriptive data from state administrators and state advocates about how they were using the funds. It wasn't designed to be comparative or anything. It was supposed to just give them an opportunity. What are the different ways you're using the funds? So we could track that information on an ongoing and timely basis. So we were able to put out a report at the beginning of this year and then update it at in last month. And then we also had a report we were also able to assess how the states are using the new funds through our annual state child care assistance policies report, which every year we use to track policy changes between February of one year to February of the next. Now, conveniently, the new funding came in March of 2018, so it was very helpful to show the difference between February 2018, right before states got the new money, and the following February 2019. And that information for that Child Care Assistance Policies report, we collect from state administrators, and we ask them about 5 key policy areas. So what we wanted to understand through these different projects was to identify how states are using the new funds. Just like others have discussed here, we wanted to demonstrate how the new funds are making a difference for children, families, and child care providers. It's really always important to come back to what these policy changes really mean to the families who are being served and those who are working with those families. It was to highlight innovative activities supported by the new funds to give states and state advocates and state administrators some ideas about how they could use the funds. It was to indicate what is not a priority for the use of the new funds, to look more closely at that and to see what's not getting addressed. To emphasize remaining gaps in child care assistance programs, because as much progress as we've made with the new funds, we need to still keep pressing the case that more funding is needed. And finally, to encourage states to use the funds and use them effectively. So sort of to highlight when states were doing something good, but also to hold them accountable. And just the act of us all collecting data help states recognize that we're tracking their progress and we're kind of giving them a gentle push forward. So with that, I'll turn it over to Carlise.
Thank you, Karen. Hello, my name is Carlise King, and as Beth mentioned, I'm the director for the Early Childhood Data Collaborative at Child Trends. And I wanted to share for Child Trends, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization, and we wanted to conduct two tasks related to CCDBG. I think first we wanted to, similar to the other groups, understand how the new funds were being used. However, I would say in terms of our research questions, we generally asked how states plan to use the new funds, but we asked about specific uses of the funds related to the reauthorization requirements that states that happened in 2014. And to understand if states were using the funds to meet the requirements that they hadn't been able to meet, which requirements were being prioritized versus those that had already been met, and then a sense of what requirements still were future priorities and may need additional funds in order to complete. So our goal was to develop a national survey that would give us quantitative data about these specific uses of the new funds, but that would also allow us to understand across the states which states did or did not make specific plans around the new funding sources for specific areas such as increasing services for children, increasing payment rates, specific requirements tied to reauthorization, and then if there are other ways that states were using the funds to make sure that we were capturing that. So in addition to our national survey, we are also wanting to do additional case studies and learn specifically about, well, what are the outcomes of these plans for states? So that's something we're in the process of doing right now. For the webinar today, in our next question, I'll be sharing specifically what we learned with the national survey that we conducted, where we received responses from all 50 states, DC, and Guam. I'll hand it back to Beth for the second question.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for sharing. It's really neat to see how your different organizations are looking at and exploring the CCDBG work. So thanks for that background. A reminder to those on the phone, this is a great time to type in any questions that you have. But now we're going to shift to the second question for our presenters, and this is the good stuff. What were the key findings or the innovative strategies that you learned from your work? I'm going to let Christine kick us off again.
Okay. Thanks, Beth. It's so exciting to see everybody's work all together, because I think we all knew what each other has been doing over these months and have been collaborating really well and sharing with each other. But when you see it all in one place, it's just kind of wonderful and overwhelming. And I think, I think the lessons that we learned came out of following each other's work and each other's data collection and those kind of long-term relationships with state administrators who contribute data to us and share their lessons and share their stories, and that's really great. I think at CLASP, the work that we did, and we do all of our CCDBG work in partnership with the National Women's Law Center and also with the Partnership for America's Children. We wanted to build on, build on the data that's collected about state policies and about how states use the money, and understand the experience of state administrators and advocates in going from, again, this kind of underfunded system to reauthorization and all the new requirements that came with that, to actually having funding with them. So I feel like a lot of the lessons we've learned in the last 2 years of having the new funds available and how they use the dollars really reflect actually what we learned in working with states around reauthorization prior to the investments. So, the states used the new dollars in some really positive ways to address some really real issues that were long-standing, as I talked about before, like access and payment rates, and to move forward on some of their requirements. But I think that some of the barriers that they experienced that we learned about really reflected their experiences even before the funding came out. So there were things that the funding didn't address, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So some of those barriers are things like data systems that are are in existence and have to be changed. And if you make eligibility policy changes, that can be delayed by having to make the data system accommodate those changes, and also at the same time changing the process with which you work with families at the eligibility point, and the application process and the verification process and the culture of eligibility offices. So every time you make a policy change or investment, say in increased eligibility, one of the lessons we've learned is that you have to think of all of the ripple effects of that and how to make sure that at every point in that process, you're also thinking about equity. So for example, there were states that were poised to increase eligibility and clear their wait lists, and they did that, and that's an amazing thing. But those states didn't necessarily have the outreach in place or the understanding of where the gaps were, or maybe even the capacity for certain families' needs, like non-traditional hour care or cultural and linguistic needs, or certain geographic areas or certain age groups, to actually meet the need once they expanded the eligibility. So and so then if you try to do outreach, and I think one of the things we learned with National Women's Law Center when they hosted a gathering around outreach is, if you do outreach and the product that you are outreaching around doesn't actually meet people's needs, they're not going to use it. And so there are a lot of layered lessons, I believe, around what it actually means to change a policy and spend dollars. We also knew that I think reinforced an understanding that states don't necessarily have strong data, both in terms of who doesn't get care and who does get care, and who is providing services, who the providers are. And I think particularly in terms of input directly from families and providers, that all states, or most states, can stand to get stronger in that area so that they have a better understanding of their need, which then again informs their outreach and their design of their systems. I think I said this before, but one of the big lessons is that state appropriations and budgeting processes were sometimes a barrier, and there were literally states that couldn't spend their money, because, at least like in the first year, because the legislature didn't appropriate it. And so those kinds of legislative timelines, legislative processes, how the money flows through the state to actually get out into the community can be a real barrier. I think one of the wonderful lessons we learned was that policymakers really benefit from talking to each other and sharing strategies. So when we pulled together state administrators to talk about how they were experiencing both the reauthorization and the use of the new dollars, they really shared strategies with each other easily, had great conversations, were very innovative. And I think being able to talk to each other in an honest way about the barriers that they were all facing was really helpful. And then I think, we had some concerns about sustainability. So I don't think this was a new lesson, but I think we know that having, if we really want to have an impact and really want to have a strong system, consistent funding and more investment is needed. This wasn't enough money. Even though it was an historic increase in investment, it wasn't enough money to solve all the problems, and there were still gaps, which all of Karen's work and Jake's work and Child Trends work all reflects that. So I think that's something we all agree on, that we need to continue investing and continue building the system. Some of the things that have been really positive that we didn't expect to have as much of an impact, I would say, or at least I didn't. One is when states received their corrective action plans, they put in their state plans for how they were going to design or use their CCDBG dollars. And they had corrective action plans come back from ACF saying, that they were non-compliant in certain areas. And that in many states triggered almost immediate action. I can think of a couple of states that immediately expanded their payment rates because they got a corrective action around that piece. And so that kind of external pressure was not only useful directly, but also useful to advocates who then could make the case that it wasn't just that we know that we have this need and that we think this is the right thing to do, but you're actually risking losing federal funds because you're not in compliance. And that was a really powerful message. There was other work going on around infants and toddlers, which I think we might talk about later, but around private funding initiatives and around the preschool development grants, birth through 5, that included a lot of needs assessment, which has been very helpful in informing how states use the new funds. So I think that that feeds back into the lesson about a lack of data and understanding. I think having those needs assessments available really was a catalyst in some states for action, and that we should think about other opportunities for childcare administrators, policymakers, advocates to connect with system-wide needs assessments that are happening through Head Start, through maternal child health, through whatever other kinds of needs assessments are happen with regularity, that they can draw on to understand better what the needs of children and families are, and then how to build that capacity. And I'm sure I just went over time, so I'm going to turn it over to Jake now. Sorry about that.
Thanks so much, Christine. So going back to the stateofchildcare.org resource that I was talking about earlier, on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see some of the features of that resource. But I think the feature that was most relevant for the purposes of this particular question is our state data map, where we provide state-by-state data on both how states are using the funds and the current outcomes. So, key outcomes such as the percentage of eligible low-income children that are being served, and comparing that to the percentage of children whose parents, all their parents are in the workforce. And through this compilation of what all 5 organizations know, and through creating this map, I think that we came to 3 key conclusions when it came to the state data. First is that states are on a very wide spectrum when it comes to implementing policy related to CCDBG or CCDF. A large part of that is what Christine had just discussed with you, which is that in many states, the appropriations process held up or limited their ability to effectively implement policy. And as a result, we have some states that were able to take really strong action and bold action with the increased CCDBG funds right away. I think, we saw stories out of Maine. They implemented their reimbursement rates to the federally recommended level of 75% almost right away. We saw Arkansas pretty much take off 3,000 children off of the waiting list almost immediately. Maryland was able to effectively double their subsidy eligibility rate, so families making up to around $70,000 could still qualify for assistance. States taking really bold action when it came to the new money. But on the other end of the spectrum, we're finding that there are states who still have yet to commit the funds, and never committed the funds from even the FY fiscal year 2018, so when the increase originally happened. And so because of this, and because of the varying nature of policy, this led us to our second conclusion, which is there are severe gaps in the national data when it comes to talking about CCDBG. Some of these gaps include the lag effect of policy. So, for example, the example that you see on your screen is in Kentucky. It says 6% of eligible low-income children are being served, but a state could have just enacted a policy not too long ago. So we're not going to see necessarily the policy effects right now. Also, because states are implementing policies at different times, and some states still haven't used the funds, it's really difficult to be able to talk about CCDBG from a national perspective. And instead, it's really that state narrative that matters when it comes to talking about CCDBG. However, there are resources such as by National Women's Law Center, which you're about to hear about, that do help summarize the number of states that are doing a different number of policy actions. And then finally, we found that the federal discretionary process for discretionary appropriations also plays a role in how states are interpreting the funds. Some states were very concerned or hesitant to make bold action with the CCDBG funding. mainly because they don't offer a lot of state investments themselves, and they rely heavily on federal funds. And so because it's a discretionary process, they were concerned that they make investments and then the next appropriations year, that money could be taken away, which I think is a pretty important conclusion when it comes to talking about CCDBG and potential policy improvements that could happen moving forward. And so with that, I am now going to transition back to Karen from National Women's Law Center.
Great, thanks. I think I'm going to say a lot that's consistent with what everybody's been saying about both the progress and the remaining gaps. Using information from our report, we're able to quantify that a little bit. What we found with the new funding, states really prioritized increasing provider payment rates and reducing waiting lists because, those are both very visible and both very impactful in terms of when the provider payment rates are too low, providers struggle to support the quality of care they want to offer children, and they may be reluctant to serve families receiving child care assistance if they can get the full fee that they charge from a parent paying out of their own pocket versus a family receiving child care assistance where they may be offered a payment rate that is lower than what they typically charge. And then the waiting list, we know that families really struggle during the waiting list to afford their other expenses while trying to afford childcare without help, or they might not be able to afford childcare at all and the parents might not be able to work, or they might, have no choice but to use lower cost childcare that might not be the preference what they really want for their children. So those are really two important areas that states decided to focus on. And we saw 29 states increase their payment rates for child care providers serving families receiving child care assistance between February 2018 and February 2019. And the average increase among those states that increased, their payment rates was over $100 per month per child. And if you think, you have set that's over the course of a year when you might have 5, 10 or more children in a classroom, that makes a real impact on that provider's ability to hire teachers or maintain their facilities and buy learning materials. Just as one example, Virginia increased its payment rates for all licensed providers to the 70th percentile of 2018 market rates. That's a little bit lower than the recommended rate, but relatively close. For example, in Fairfax County, the monthly payment rate for center care for a 4-year-old increased from $1,147 to over $1,500, an increase of $368. So that's a big difference. Meanwhile, the total number of children on waiting lists for child care assistance decreased by 55%. Texas made a huge strides with the number of children on the waiting list decreasing from over 65,000 children to less than 16,500 children. Alabama, Mississippi, New Mexico, and Oregon, which had waiting lists in February 2018, were able to serve all families on those waiting lists and serve all new families who were applying. In addition to those priorities, many states were just trying to meet the requirements of the Child Care and Development Block Grant Reauthorization Law, which was approved in 2014. States still are working to implement it because when it was initially passed, even though it involved new costs, states weren't given additional resources to actually implement new provisions of the law, which entailed additional costs. So states were using the funds to meet the requirements for criminal background checks, annual monitoring visits to providers, providing families with 12 months of eligibility without interruption, and then supporting teacher training and professional development. There were some areas that states were emphasized less, such as income eligibility limits. That big increase in Maryland was really notable. Especially they hadn't increased their income limit. They hadn't even adjusted for inflation for over a decade. So that was very important. However, it was one of the very few states that increased its income limit by more than just an inflation adjustment. And so despite the infusion of the new funding, there's significant gaps that remain. A family with an income above 150% of poverty, which is just around $32,000 a year for a family of three, could not qualify for child care assistance in 13 states. 15 states still had waiting lists or frozen intake for child care assistance. And only 4 states set payment rates for child care providers at federally recommended levels. So, as everybody has been saying, there's still more work to do. And so I will turn that over to Carlise now. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Karen. So I'm going to share just some of the key findings of what we learned in our national study. But I think just to echo some of the previous comments that were made, I think we similarly found that not all uses of the funds were necessarily equal. And so I think as I go through our key findings, I just want to share some of the things that we learned just in terms of how some of these different actions look different across states. And as was mentioned before, that when we interviewed state administrators for our survey, some had implemented their funds, some were still in the planning process, and some were planning to implement. So I think one of the key recommendations from our brief is that it'll be really important at the state level to examine what these policy changes ultimately look like in a particular state. And I'll explain a little as I go through our overall findings. And I'm going to start at the top, go to the right, and then go to the second row. So I think as was mentioned before, we found that more than half of states anticipated serving more children as a result of the new funding. And there have been several statistics out there estimating the number of children, additional children that are potentially going to be served with these funds, or as Karen had noted, wait lists that have already been reduced in some states. I think what we learned from our survey is that while some states were able to project the number of additional children served, there were several states that were unsure about how the combination of increasing their rates and funding and how that would impact funding expanded slots and how that would balance out. So I think that's where, again, depending on the need and how those rates are being implemented, that may change ultimately the number of children that are served. And so I think we were noting just to make sure to kind of keep an eye on that and looking how that translates into your particular state. We also asked about priority populations of children that states were using the funds for. And we learned that children experiencing homelessness was the largest number states reported with 14 states, as well as prioritizing the funds for families that were very low income first, as well as infants and toddlers for new slots that the funding was going to be used for. And our second finding, as was already been mentioned, there were the largest number of states, 44 states reported using the new funds to increase payment rates. And this is compared to 38 states that reported that they were using the funds to support implementation of one or more of the requirements around reauthorization. I think the piece that I wanted to share about increasing the payment rates as we were collecting information from states is that states, in terms of when they responded to increasing payment rates, it varied in terms of the comprehensiveness of that increase. So some states may have been increasing rates just for center-based providers. Some, the increased rates were for those that were providing higher quality. We saw in several states priorities to increase rates for infant toddler care. But I think the important thing to think about in looking at these is that when it says increasing payment rates, that may be for some, but not necessarily all types of care, and kind of looking at how that looks within each of the individual states. In terms of using the funds to meet the new requirements. As I mentioned before, in terms of what we were looking to learn, we know that different states were in different places in terms of being able to implement the new requirements around reauthorization. Some states were already meeting the requirements and some required additional funds. So we really wanted to understand, okay, well, what specific activities are the new funds really going to support? And we found that states most commonly reported that were using the funds to meet reauthorization requirements, and as I mentioned, that's about 38 states, that states most commonly reported using the funds to conduct comprehensive background checks for providers, with 23 states. Next, reducing parent copays, which was about 11 states. So you see, just jumping down from the focus on the background checks to parental copays for immediate uses of the funds, was over 10 states. And so we also asked about states' future priorities for the funds. So as was mentioned before, we did hear from states that the additional funding wasn't enough necessarily to meet all the requirements. So we wanted to understand, okay, well, based on how you plan to use these funds, what is going to be kind of a current priority and what might be a future priority for your state. And I think that's where we saw a shift in terms of what states reported, where the three most commonly reported priorities for future funds was reducing parent copays. Background checks was also a future priority, as well as annual inspections for license exempt providers. And then in asking about states' need for additional funds to meet the requirements, we also wanted to understand how states were using funds to support quality improvement activities. And so there we saw that more than half of states plan to use the funds for professional development, as well as investments in infant toddler care. And I'll share in our next slides about where you can access resources around what states plan to do. A lot of states shared different strategies around developing professional development networks, training, mentoring programs to really help support their workforce, as well as putting funds toward scholarships and financial incentives to support professional development and workforce stability in their states. And then for the last key finding, as was kind of mentioned before, we wanted to understand what additional funding was needed and then for what. We found that a majority of the states, 29 that we surveyed, reported that additional funds were not sufficient to meet the reauthorization requirements. And of those states that said that it wasn't sufficient, 22 states shared with us what they would need additional funds for. And I think that this is reflective of what Karen was sharing previously and what I was explaining in terms of states using the funds for payment rates, that raising the provider payment rates to the 75th percentile was the most commonly reported use for any additional funds that the state received, as well as, again, this showed up a need to meet requirements related to criminal background checks for providers. And so I think this gets into understanding where states, the differences in terms of where states are setting their rates. And as I was saying before, how comprehensive, how those rates are applied geographically, by type of care, by age of child, by quality level, and being able to describe where those investments are going, where those increases in payment rates are going, and where the additional funds would be used to increase payment rates and for who. And then just separately in general, we include, and I'll share this, go into a little bit more detail on the resources slide, overall funding for all states, if they received increased funds, what would be their top priorities. And I will go into that a little bit later, but I will hand it back to Beth so we can go through the resources.
Thanks, Carlise. And it's great to see some of these questions coming across. Panelists, this should warm your hearts. Folks are asking where they can find more information, if there are reports or fact sheets out there. So kind of a perfect segue into our next question around what resources are currently available. And Christine, I'll kick it off to you to share how listeners can learn more and engage more with your work.
Absolutely. So we have a few things highlighted on this slide and our main website for CCDBG. Again, I would say, I think all of the resources that the other panelists have shared around how the money has actually been spent and how that's been reported and tracked are really important. I think part of our role is to point out where some of the inequities are and also what some of the state experiences are beyond their expenditures, but just, how do they get the money out the door and what are the challenges to that? So the first piece on the left there is a report that was written actually mostly, it was started at least before the new funding came out and was really about the reauthorization requirements. And so one of the things I would point out just listening to Carlise is that the things that states say they most need more funds for or that they prioritized, almost all of them reflect newish requirements in the reauthorization law. So that law really has driven the use of the funds in a certain way in many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases. So the background checks, the professional development, the monitoring, license exempt programs, those were all very challenging provisions for states, particularly without any funds. And so that report really has some findings at the end about what would be helpful to states in terms of supporting them in making changes to their child care policies to comply with reauthorization. Something that, as Carlise pointed out, most states are still non-compliant on at least some things. So it's still a big issue. The other pieces that I've highlighted here are really mostly about the potential for new dollars and the potential and the inequities in current use. So we have inequitable access, which is, again, looks state by state and how children are accessing child care subsidies by race and ethnicity. And I think that's a really important document if people are trying to think about how to get dollars out the door into communities. And also we have, fact sheets on the numbers of children who could potentially be served for if additional money was funded or if cuts were made. Or so if you're doing advocacy or learning about the federal appropriations process, thinking about how your state dollars are used, these are all good resources that can help inform that conversation. And I'll pass it over to Jake.
Thanks, Christine. So I've already discussed the stateofchildcare.org website, which is a kind of consolidated one-stop shop on CCDBG, but I also wanted to highlight that Child Care Aware of America has our 2019 state snapshots, which provide state descriptions for all 50 states. Yes, about how the funding was used, but a larger emphasis is on why more funding is still needed. And so a lot of these descriptions really go into the details of why more funding is needed. And within this website, actually, we and the one pagers that we have, which I'll talk about in a moment, we discuss the statistic that actually comes from National Women's Law Center, which is that even with the increase, federal funding for child care is still $1 billion less than what it was in fiscal year 2001. And so that is why there is still a need in all of the 50 states. In addition to this description, we also have just some data on childcare within the state. But of course, what I think is actually more useful is data on what an increase in funding in CCDBG actually means for that state. When it comes to talking with federal policymakers about CCDBG, I often think it's a disservice when we just keep referring to it in terms of, billions and billions of dollars, because the truth is that when it's divided between 50 states, for some states that could be just, a few million dollars or whatnot. The national organizations this year or this past summer, we were advocating for a $5 billion increase in discretionary funding, but a $5 billion increase is, only less than $10 million for, about 5 states or so. So it's really not as much money as a lot of federal policymakers think it is. And so we divide that up by each state when you go through it. I also just want to note that as we have these sort of qualitative descriptions, we did actually have a state organization fact check or actually write in descriptions themselves. And so you'll notice, like in the example provided with Alabama, that the Alabama Office of Child Care Subsidy actually approved of the description that you're reading. So just to kind of, for quality assurance purposes, we worked with organizations within each state. And then finally, there is a one-pager that can be downloaded it's two-sided. The front side kind of describes the history of CCDBG and sort of the national story, but on the back side actually has the same description that we have on the website. And so each state has its own one-pager with state-specific information that can be provided to either state or federal policymakers. And now I will pass it over to Karen again.
Thanks. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So I just will say quickly, those are the child care reports that I discussed in this call, our early progress, state child care assistance policies 2019. You see the link there. That's on our website, and also a report on how states are using the new child care and development block grant funds. That is the more descriptive report, and that's also on our website. We'll also have in the coming months, hopefully, some individualized state-by-state fact sheets based on our state child care assistance policies report. So I'll turn it over to Carlise. Thanks.
Thanks, Karen. And I will also quickly go through so we can get to this couple of questions. So I just want to share, there are 3 sources of information I want to encourage you guys to check out. I think first we have an interactive website we developed showcasing the key findings that I shared from our report. You can also access the research brief as well as an Excel sheet summarizing additional information shared with us from state administrators as part of the survey. So as I mentioned before, where states added additional details in terms of exactly the types of workforce development or infant toddler activities, or exactly how they're implementing payment rates or changing eligibility. We noted that in that Excel sheet, and you can see that there state by state. Next slide. We also have state profiles available. You can find your state information there with your responses, as well as background information on the total federal funding received, information around family income eligibility, wait list and maximum payment rates that we sourced from National Women's Law Center, or was updated by states as part of our survey. Next slide. And then I also just wanted to highlight a recent brief by the National Research Center on Hispanic Children and Families that looked at, reanalyzed some of the information from the data from our national survey to look at how CCDBG funds were being spent in 13 states, where 80% of the nation's low-income Hispanic children live. Beth?
Great. Thank you all. That was so interesting. Please, again, folks, keep adding in questions. We may not get to them all. I know we only have a few minutes left, but I'll work with the presenters to send out answers to questions that we don't have time to answer during the webinar. So first off, our first question, how have states used CCDBG funds to support unlicensed caregivers meet the new health and safety standards? And I'm actually going to open that up. I'm not sure which panelist might want to answer. So if one of you could hop on and let us know what you think.
Hi, this is Karen from the National Women's Law Center. We haven't looked specifically at, exactly how they're using the funds for that particular purpose, but I do appreciate the highlighting the legally exempt care, because that's a really critical component of care for our youngest children, care for during non-traditional hours is often, that's, the family, friend, and neighbor care is the best and sometimes only option to meet that need. And for other reasons, families might choose it. So it's really important that they're provided the opportunity to meet the new requirements, including annual visits. And I know, not necessarily with the new funds, but I know some states are, have used, innovative strategies such as relying on the child care resource and referral agencies. I believe in Nevada and Idaho, we had some conversations where they're using that to provide the, resources they need to meet the basic health and safety requirements, to provide, different strategies to reach providers through different means to help them meet the training requirements. So we have a report that we did where it was small scale, and again, not directly connected to the new funds, but different approaches states were helping to move these exempt providers to compliance with the CCDBG requirements. So that is on our website. I don't have the web address handy, but I could certainly send it to others as follow-up.
This is Christina at CLASP. I would just build on that and say we've talked with a couple of states specifically, and that the approach in terms, again, not necessarily with new dollars, but with dollars, many, some states have hired additional licensors or monitors, but I think the most effective states have done it have really paid attention to training and professional development, and making sure that the folks who are doing the monitoring of license exempt programs have an understanding of what is the different and what's the same about these providers that families rely on. And often, at least anecdotally, often these models include supports. So not just going in and saying, are you meeting the health and safety standards, but here's a smoke detector, here's some other resources to help with your curriculum, here's, whatever the pieces are that that the license exempt providers may need. And then I think some states are also exploring using almost kind of a home visiting model to reach license exempt providers. So I think there's a lot of kind of interesting things going on in that space, and again, driven by a new requirement and reauthorization that license exempt providers be monitored, which could be really challenging, but also can be a real opportunity, because since, as Karen said, so many infants and toddlers and other children are in license exempt care.
Thanks, Karen and Christine. I'm going to do another question. So, do you know what arguments states made to their legislators to increase the reimbursement rates to providers? I don't know if Christine or Jacob, in your state work, if you came across any examples here.
Well, I know of at least one state that, as I was saying earlier, that kind of quickly raised their rates in response to the corrective action plan that came. And I think when advocates learned of that they were under corrective action for the rates and they raised it with the state, it moved very quickly. So I think, I think the kind of requirement, but that's only really relevant to states that had very low rates for under 25th percentile for some sector, as Carlise was saying, of their providers. So I think in general, one of the things that's helping to drive rates is having to do being now required to do, not just to do updated market rate surveys or some other methodology, but actually having to tie the rates that they're paying to the most recent market rate survey. So all of those kinds of federal requirements are giving advocates a leg to stand on when they go to the legislature and say we're behind and we're undervaluing this service. So.
Yeah,
Okay, well,
I would.
Oh, go ahead, Jacob.
No, we can, if we can get in another question or close it out. It's 2 o'clock, so I don't want to take up any more time.
Yeah, I know it is 2 o'clock. So what I'm going to do is circulate the rest of these questions to the presenters offline, and we'll follow up by email with a link to the recording and then with some additional questions. And Karen, we can add in resources and links to that document as well. So thank you all so much for joining today, for your interest in this topic, and thank you to our presenters for sharing your great work. If you have questions and didn't get a chance to ask them, do feel free to send me an email. My email address is there, and it was on the registration link as well. I'm happy to pass your questions along and connect you with the folks that you need to be connected to. So thank you for joining us today. We will be in touch soon with more information, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thanks.
Thank you.